Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom, and in today's video, I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Drain. Dr. Drain, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Dom. Thanks for having me.
Anytime. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
So, for the audience, if you guys are new to Dr. Drain, I'll go ahead and give a brief introduction, and then we'll discuss all things Balthazar, Trinitarian theology, and Christology. So, Dr. Daniel Drain earned his BA in philosophy and theology at DeSales University and earned both an MTS and a PhD at the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family. He taught at DeSales University, Immaculata University, and was a full-time faculty member at St. Bernard's School of Theology and Ministry in Rochester, New York. He now serves as the director of the Office for Life and Family for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, and also as an adjunct professor at St. Charles Borromeo Seminary. He is an ordinary member of the Sacra Doctrina Project, a peer reviewer for Word on Fire Academic, and other scholarly journals of Catholic theology, and was recently appointed to the Advisory Council of the Administrative Committee of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Dr. Drain wrote his dissertation on the theology of Hans Ers von Balthazar, a Swiss Catholic theologian, and the title of the dissertation was Saving Finite Freedom on the Meaning of Freedom in Hans Ers von Balthazar's Theology of Redemption. So, Dr. Drain, it's great to have you on. I can't wait to pick your brain. Welcome once again, and thanks for being on.
Yeah, thanks. My pleasure. Listeners, I think already know that Dom is an impressive interviewer. You're the equivalent in my mind of Sean Evans for theology in terms of your preparation. You read the whole dissertation to prepare to ask me a couple of questions, which is like, I think six other people have read it, excluding my wife, who has not read it. So thank you.
You're welcome. No, it was a delight to read. Absolutely. Well, I guess to kick this off, let's maybe start with the basic question of who in the heck was Hans Ers von Balthazar?
Yeah, well, it depends on who you ask. I'm really bad at historical details and dates and stuff. He was born in 1905, died in 1988. Many say for sure he's one of the most important figures in 20th century Catholicism, and I would put it that broadly. Certainly Catholic theology, both as a sort of private theologian and as a man of the church, serving in various capacities. While unlike his friends and contemporaries, Henri de Lubac and Joseph Ratzinger, he was not a participant at the Second Vatican Council. He was doing important work that informed the intellectual work that happened at Vatican II, including a sort of prophetic call for an emphasis on the power of holiness in the church today. Mm-hmm. And for sure was a major figure in the interpretation and implementation of the council and the state of Catholic theology immediately following the council. He was one of the original members of the International Theological Commission, and indeed served on the commission until his death. So he was reappointed and reappointed and reappointed for 5-year term after 5-year term. There are a number of good places to find decent introductions to him. Bishop Robert Barron, at that point Father Barron, did a 2-part just intro to who was von Balthazar. So if you want graphics and a little bit more text and stuff, that's really great. Yeah. But one of the things he points out there, and I love to tell people, is that John Paul II asked von Balthazar to be a cardinal twice. Balthazar refused both times. And then the third time he didn't ask. He said, it's happening. And on the way to Rome for that, Balthazar died. And Bishop Barron jokes that in a way Balthazar was saying, I really didn't want it. Referred to him as Cardinal von Balthazar, but I think technically in the way the church thinks about the naming of cardinals, he is one. And so I just refer to him as Balthazar, as most do, but technically we could speak of Hans Ers Cardinal von Balthazar.
Gotcha.
He with friends like that and with an influence on the church like that, his funeral liturgy, the homily was preached by Rottzinger. De Lubac called him perhaps the most cultured man of our time. And that's why I say he's important for Catholicism, not just theology. He had a truly masterful orchestral grasp of music, of aesthetics. He was not a consumer, but he was a real virtuosic appreciator of art, opera, of play, of theater. He retranslated something like 7 or 8 times Paul Claudel's piece, De Satin Yeshua, the Satin Slipper, which he
Oh
thought was the most masterful expressions of Christianity in literature.
yeah,
So yeah, in that sense, not just theology, although people tend to get pissy about him for particular theological opinions, which when you
yeah,
see the whole man, in my opinion, when you see the whole man, when you see his impact, and when you see the particular context of those issues, and that's what I've argued, it's in fact all of a piece to propose the kinds of things that he does. And so
yeah,
one of the things I like to say controversially is that you can't be mad at him about one of those things. You actually kind of have to take him or leave him.
yeah.
I think. So,
No, that's fantastic. I mean, he's basically what you're saying is that he's a synthetic thinker. There's a unity in his thought, and so you can't just kind of pick and choose. You kind of have to see the form that he's looking at to speak
yeah,
in a
yeah.
Balthazarian
And there
way.
you
You
go,
know?
using his language to see the
Yeah,
Schau der Welt, to see the whole.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's right.
No, so I haven't read that much Balthazar. I have read a couple of his little books. I read one on the papacy, one on the Blessed Virgin,
Mm,
and of course, I read your dissertation. And throughout the last several years, I've listened to various Balthazarians talk about him.
yeah,
And the more, I mean, a picture is starting to form in my mind. I'm eventually hoping to pick up his trilogy, which is going it's a beast. I mean, but one thing that I've noticed is his influence on Ratzinger. I hadn't noticed it for a long time until recently. It started to click. Like Balthazar's insights on freedom, on personalism. I mean, there's definitely his metaphysical insights. It's definitely present all throughout Ratzinger in my experience, from what I hear.
I
I mean, I
think that's right.
first noticed de Lubach's influence on Ratzinger. I joked to some friends of mine because I was once having a conversation with a friend of mine who didn't like de Lubach but did like Ratzinger. Probably hadn't read any de Lubach, but
Right.
uh, and I said to him, "Look, man," I said, de Lubach's influence on Ratzinger, it can jokingly be compared to the influence of the Holy Spirit on sacred scripture. Like it permeates, like,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
so you can't just not like one and like the other. Like you got to read them anyway. But
I
so
think too,
go ahead.
I mean, just to comment on that for a moment, is that you don't see a lot of influence in terms of texts. In fact, uh,
Hmm.
when there are some key places where Ratzinger will mention an idea of Balthazar to say that he goes there and I go no further. He actually says this about some of the Holy
Oh, he
Saturdays
does.
in particular.
Okay.
But I think still the imagery is apt for the influence, and precisely an indication that you wouldn't detect it is because they were such close friends, like actual
Yeah.
dinner table retreats, prayer collaborators, such that the influence is
Yeah.
not primarily to be seen in their texts, but in the I've found in teaching, I always explicitly assign Ratzinger and speak in Ratzingerian language, but the underbelly of
Yeah.
it for my formation and what
Is
I'm actually
Balthazar.
doing is Balthazar.
Yeah.
And I've started to say, even to students, like, look, Ratzinger is just saying a lot more clearly or immediately accessibly what
Yeah.
Balthazar argued, skipping a
Yeah.
lot of the scholarly apparatus around it and some of the, this is my opinion,
Yeah.
this was their opinion. Ratzinger is far more concise. He's a great synthesizer in that way. But for sure, I mean, the connection there, I think, is thick and it's deep.
Yeah. No, I mean, I had the opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. Nick Healy. We were talking about de Lubac. This was a few months ago, and I told him that I've been reading a lot of Ratzinger, but I
Yeah.
hadn't started reading Balthazar, and he told me, "Oh, good, Ratzinger is the best way to enter into Balthazar." So
Yeah. Yeah.
he's something to that effect. Yeah.
He's my
Um,
doctor. He's my director,
oh,
Dr.
he
Healy.
is. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Awesome. Well, so I guess the first question that I have for you that might be a good segue, or a good door into a good fragment through which to see the whole might be the concept of kenosis.
Sure.
Maybe just as a simple question, what is kenosis, and where does this term come from? Yeah.
There are versions of kenosis or kenotic theology that have sprung up over the course of the church's history. In particular, as soon as you say that, most people with a good theological understanding of the last couple centuries are going to immediately be worried about 19th century German kenoticism in particular.
Mhm.
Backing up from that, the language is first in Scripture. It's first, for example, present in the prologue to John's Gospel, but perhaps more accessibly in the hymn to Christ in Philippians 2, referring to this emptying this pouring out of self that's descriptive of the incarnation as the mission of the Son, right? Who emptied himself, taking on the form of a slave. So it's always kenosis attached to this idea of the morphe theo, the form of God, and the mission of Christ in history taking on the morphe doulou, the form of a slave. And so this a description of self-emptying or even of self-gift, although emptying preserves a sense of the pain that might take place in it. And so therefore it also fits with incarnation as the beginning and cross and resurrection as the end of the mission. So kenosis first refers and is grounded in how we describe God's decisive entering into history from beyond time, namely the descent of the Son into the world for our salvation. So from there, we know that God has acted. So God speaks, and it's for us. So for us, pro nobis, and kenosis means whatever that is, that God has come into our state, and that's just Paul describes that in the language of emptying. I mentioned the prologue to John's Gospel. It's interesting, actually, the tabernacle at my parish church, it has some of the Greek of John's Gospel on and it's a tent-shaped tabernacle. We're so fortunate.
Oh, wow.
But it's a hologos sarx kai eskenosen en hemin. The word became flesh, and that's eskenosen, which has that root for kenosis in it. So sense of dwelling among us, pitching his tent. It also has that, I think, connotation and at least some of its verbal expression to it. So it's about God being with us. And you can remove the immediate context of like that involving a change or a diminution or a threat to God's immutability, which is some of the aberration you get then in 19th century kenotic theology, that God has to become less than himself and really becomes himself in being among us. But kenosis first speaks, it's a way of characterizing God's presence among us, specifically in the incarnation. And a presence which reveals his glory as for us, and that for us also reveals his glory. So it refers to that. Trinitarian kenosis, then, and this is not just Balthazar, although Balthazar has become very famous for speaking in this way, I would say, reflects the fact that the incarnation is disclosive of God's innermost self, that for sure our mortality is made the instrument of our salvation, but not simply an instrument. It also really and truly discloses who God is. The best post-conciliar expression of this is probably familiar to many of your listeners, and especially anyone who also listens to Larry Chapp. It's Gaudium et Spes 22, right? Christ reveals the Father and his love while revealing to man his most high calling. So this insight that in coming among us, he truly reveals who God is. There's a one-to-one correspondence between the person of Christ and the identity of the Father, and that one-to-one correspondence happens as God and as man for us. So all of that is disclosive of the Trinity as a self-emptying. Now, to be fair, in particular, Von Balthazar will speak about a kenosis on the part of the Father in the Trinity. And there, kenosis is meant to express the reality that the persons of the Trinity are consubstantial with one another. So when the Father gives the Son when the Son proceeds from the Father gives the whole of his divinity, which also, as it were, substantializes him as the Father in the Spirit. So kenosis is really meant to bespeak this reality of eternal gift as describing the relations of procession. So it's both meant to honor the Thomistic language of subsistent relations and describe it in this language of gift and of personal difference that, for sure, yes, is maybe more amenable to modern ears, but is still true to what we can faithfully say in the Thomistic tradition, I think, about the nature of personal distinction in the Trinity.
Go ahead.
Well,
just to pause there, because this idea of giftedness, you said in a certain sense is more modern, but also it seems to me that, especially because Balthazar has appropriated, from what I've been hearing, the metaphysical insights of Ferdinand Ulrich in terms of
Yes.
a created being, but as gift.
Right.
And I'd like to talk about that, but just as you were talking, I was listening to you describe kenosis. I mean, for the audience, the Philippians chapter 2, the hymn is so beautiful. I mean, you can read it over and over and over again. There's so much there. I mean, it's a good morning prayer, honestly.
Right.
It's just so beautiful. But the way you were describing it, the link between incarnation and Paschal mystery, um, reminded me, because right now in our Bible study on Wednesdays, we're reading through the book of Isaiah, and we're towards the end of the book, and there's these passages about God's compassion, about
Yes.
his almost maternal love
Yes.
towards
Yeah.
Israel. And it's in Isaiah that he talks about, God being Emmanuel, dwelling among us, and to me, it's so beautiful to see God's, his love, almost like the love of a broken heart. And I'm thinking of Margaret Turk's book on atonement, the
Oh
kind
man.
of,
Hero.
the
Yeah.
origins of this kind of display in the Son, in the heart of the Father, so to speak. I'm sure my
Yeah.
language is completely off, but you get what I'm saying. Um, but Yeah. So, and last thing, as you were saying this, an insight kind of came back to me that I used to know from somewhere, which is that in the Nativity, Christ in the manger is in swaddling clothes, but it's almost like a burial shroud.
Yes.
As
Yeah.
he's in the manger, the mystery of his death is present in his birth. I find that to
Yeah.
beautifully link everything you were saying. But anyway, to go back to what you were saying about gift, right? To kind of unpack more this intra-Trinitarian kenosis, whatever that means, right? You do at one point bring up in the dissertation the concept that basically the Latin phrase is esse significat completum et simplex sed non subsistens, and the translation is something like created being, right? Created esse is complete and simple but non-subsistent. And so how maybe would this kind of set us up to understand this giftedness, but not just in creation, but like in the Trinity, if that makes sense?
Sure. Sure. Well, you just had someone on who does a very good job
Yeah.
of explaining that role in sort of Thomistic metaphysics vis-a-vis Ferdinand Ulrich. So Dr. Coleman, I know, gave a good explanation of that. But I'll tell you how I think about it. And I'm in the midst of teaching an intensive Christology seminar to some Dominican sisters,
Yeah.
St. Charles Seminary, and so I have the pleasure of presenting them some Balthazarian theses, and then just getting my butt
Yeah.
kicked for the rest of the 3 hours with questions. And well, we're coming toward a
Yeah.
really, really, I think, fruitful synthesis. One thing that has come back up for me is, so it's really key in the early Christological and Trinitarian controversies, this synthesis that Chalcedon achieves of describing Christ as one person in two natures. And one of the things that's achieved in that synthesis is recognizing that there's no such thing as a free-floating nature. That in fact, it's the person who has natures. So person is something larger than nature. And hence the prior confusion over the difference between hypostasis and essence and ousia and all of that. It's the person who has natures, right?
Yeah.
Which means that even for us, we are persons, and as Balthazar would say, we can become theological persons through our baptism and vocational alignment, who participate in human nature, which doesn't exist out there without us. And because it's something which sort of comes to be in my actual existent living out of it, it's a real thing. It's whole and complete. It's spirit. It's a spiritual reality. So it's not divisible. It's not mute. It doesn't change, right?
Yeah.
That same dynamic is present in the relationship between person and nature. Natures aren't out there, but I have a nature for real.
Yeah.
And I can actually participate also in the divine nature by confirmation to Christ.
Oh.
And so there's that relationship of it's perfect, it's complete, it's an image of divine goodness, which is a corollary that Ulrich always talks about with that the perfect and complete yet non-subsistent somehow images God's own being. That same dynamic at work in the relation of natures in Christ, but also in the relationship of human persons to the person of Christ. So we are persons in the one person. Most truly. So just to say, I mean, in a way, it's not clarifying at all. It's just to say that this actually bespeaks really well the entire mystery of unity in difference and difference in unity. It describes the structure reality, even of especially, I think, of personal being, right?
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. Maybe to let's see. So I'm trying to grasp a little deeper what you're saying. So the natures in Christ. So Christ as a person is in the two natures, but his human nature, in a certain sense, is complete and simple, but non-subsistent. But he receives it. Is that what you're saying? When in the kenosis, he enters into
Yeah,
it.
I should clarify. So part of the achievement of Chalcedon at that particular historical moment is to say into natures and not out of two natures, giving the sense that the natures
Oh,
are sort of there, and then the person of the Logos comes to inhabit them, or
yeah.
comes to inhabit a fully formed nature, but rather that what comes to exist in time is the singular
Yeah.
subject who is the person of the divine Logos,
Oh,
united
okay.
the fullness of humanity personally. So this is why,
Gotcha.
Chalcedon and the fathers around it will always repeat one and the same, the singular subject, and then
Yeah,
describe.
yeah.
Even at Chalcedon, this is part of the ambiguity that opens up to the era of Maximus and further.
Mm,
Chalcedon has to say hypostasis, so this language of sort of personal, individual subsistence, and it
mhm.
says prosopon, the more Greek language of
Yeah,
uh, face, mask, personal dialogic thing. So in order to say what it means by person, it still kind of says the individual substance of a rational nature bit that comes to develop in Boethius and Thomas, and it holds
yeah,
on to the prosopon thing. So we're still at that point in history struggling with this reality that the
yeah,
person is a sort of infinite depth that
yeah.
instantiates, makes real something which is a true participation in God, but which is really only fleshed out in personal being.
Gotcha.
You don't
Yeah, no, that
see,
makes sense.
you don't see cat, you don't see dog, you don't see man, you see this man, this woman.
Yeah, yeah.
And in the same way, actually, what we say is that you don't see divinity, you see the Father.
Mhm.
Actually, you see
Yeah.
the Son, and therefore you see the Father. And to be brought into that relationship is to see and be in the Spirit. So that valence of unity and difference, difference and unity to speak about persons is at the heart of the structure of being. And I think that's what
Mhm.
Ulrich in particular uncovers. And so that's
Gotcha.
at the heart of how Balthazar is willing to use this language of total outpouring on the part of the Father. The Father doesn't give something, he gives himself and the whole of himself in such a way that the
Yeah,
Son is nothing but the Father's word. And the Father is
yeah.
nothing but his gift of self to the Son. In speaking the word, he breathes forth the Spirit is a sort of ancient formulation of that shows something of that.
Mm,
I'm
yeah.
gesturing around categories, but that's a sort of
No,
word
no.
cloud, how I think
Yeah,
about it. Yeah.
that's great, that's great. Yes, and at one point in your dissertation, something kind of, struck me, which is you kinda gave a summary of, the metaphysical schema that Balthazar is following. Um, Basically, you call it, maybe Balthazar calls it this, the fourfold distinction,
Yeah.
when it comes to the miracle of being. I mean, I had heard of the real distinction, essence, existence,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
you started talking about the fourfold distinction. Maybe could you unpack, like, how that works, for the
Yeah,
audience?
I'll do my best. I'm allergic to
Yeah.
hanging on to particular phrases to a certain
Oh, okay.
point,
Yeah.
but I'll do my best. So this
Okay.
is language directly from von Balthazar, and in particular, the end of the fifth volume of Glory of the Lord, which is where he
Mhm.
treats modern metaphysics. There's
Mhm.
a 50 to 70 page section called The Fourfold Difference and the Miracle of Being. And
Mm.
this is where he is aiming to describe how, in elementary, original human experience, we come to know the goodness of reality. And he identifies basically four stages for that. So he's describing the birth of human consciousness and
Okay.
therefore human personalization, not a metaphysical, we don't become persons through our awareness, but it's the
Yeah.
coming to awareness of personal being.
Mhm.
Um, and situated at one of those levels, and I forget if it's the second or the third, Dr. Healy would crucify me for that, is the Thomistic real distinction, or what Balthazar will rephrase as the ontological distinction. So here's
Okay.
how it works. Simply this. In the perhaps idyllic, but in the normative human experience, human beings come to an awareness of themselves in a dialogic relationship of love. This is where Balthazar speaks about what he just comes to call the mother's smile. A child comes to know the reality himself, the world, and God first as a gift from another to himself. So what Balthazar sees is that in the elementary experience of a mother smiling at her child, and in particular when the child finally smiles back for the first time, which developmental psychologists, everyone will show you is a key moment of, okay, this child is going to thrive. What's happening there is that the mother is the whole world at that point. And the world gives to the child the capacity to recognize that I'm not the world, and that recognition happens by way of gratitude. It's not first one thing and then gratitude, but it's the responsive smile of the child. So in this episode, the mother's smile, the child gradually comes to an awareness that I am not my mother. I forget if this is the first stage or second stage. I am not my mother. And then my mother is not the world. And then the world is not God. So that's where some of the differences are. That's it.
Oh, wow. Yeah, no, that's very, very helpful.
So that,
I mean,
the point being that we come to an awareness of the gift structure of creation normatively through this experience of the welcoming love of a mother who shows us that it's good that I'm not another. It's good that another is not the whole world. It's good that the whole world is not God. And all of that is shot through top to bottom with this reality of you are loved in the sense that you have been given to be, and that's first expressed for all of us at an elementary level through this experience of gratitude. So that discloses then the gift structure of creation or the miracle of being.
Yeah.
And that, if that's the way created being works, and then the Son redeems us by way of that elementary experience of being born, the Creator who has become the Son of His daughter, all of that amazing patristic language of reversal and oxymoronic polarity. All of that shows that this elementary experience of birth, of family, of motherhood, of relational I-thou establishment is apt to show us who God is.
Yeah.
Not just apt, but actually shows us who God is.
Yeah.
So
no,
that's
that's
there.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I mean, I just love the whole personalist gift language, I, thou, the relationality. Was it Norris Clark? Someone was talking about the kind of co-origination of substance and relation in ontology. Yeah. It seems to me this might just be the next step in the kind of Christological and Trinitarian conclusions of Christianity's influence on our way of thinking philosophically, if that makes sense.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. This place of relation. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. That if we want to say something like individual substance of a rational nature as a definition of a human person, what we really need to mean by individual is also community, or this sense that reality is given to itself. I mean, you're probably very familiar with this. I fall back on Rotzinger's homilies on creation.
Okay.
Precisely, which show that mysteriously it's good to not be God. God even says that's like the message from Genesis 1, right?
Yeah.
God is everything, and it's good to not be God. In fact, and it's very good for the man to not be the woman, or for the two of them together to be the image of God, which is nevertheless not God. All of that's good. Mm-hmm. I think it's of a piece with how Balthazar casts metaphysics as a sort of lived reality. Yeah, for sure, it's personalist, phenomenological, but he does think he's describing being in an absolute sense. Yeah.
No, I mean, it seems to me that from listening to what you're saying and thinking about this, there is that kind of initial phenomenological moment, but if you think about it more, you start to realize that it's not just phenomenological. There's something that's being revealed of the intrinsic structure of being, which is that being is gift.
That's right. That's well said. I think in a way too, what a lot of people tend to miss, I'm not saying you missed it. What a lot of people tend to miss is that Balthazar is only willing to start there because of the incarnation. In other words, because God, the Son reveals the Father through becoming a human child, we are allowed to see in the experience of becoming a human child what it's like to be man and what it's like to be God.
Yeah.
So phenomenological, yes, but first Christological. I think that's and he doesn't always say that. So for sure, some of the blame is like he's just kind of doing it. He's not always explaining in methodological terms, but that's like actually why he does it.
No, that's fantastic. I do want to talk about certain terms here shortly about, the difference between immanent and economic and inversions. But before we do that, I wanted to focus in a little bit on freedom. I mean, this is a huge part of your dissertation. One thing that struck me immediately as I was reading through it was the polarities of freedom. I had never heard this before. Basically, this idea of the kind of initial you in the dissertation you wrote autonomous motion. So the given, the way I understand this is the kind of letting be of the otherness as not myself, right?
Yeah,
And then the second moment is you called consent, or this might be Balthazar's language, consent, which you associate with task. So in this sense, I'm thinking of response, right? So first is kind of reception. Second seems to be maybe just unpack that.
No, I think that's exactly right. So yeah, Balthazar, and it is directly from him. And a couple of people have written about this. There's some good monographs on Balthazar that pull this stuff out, probably better than I do. Aidan Nichols has written about it. He's got a million books on Balthazar. There's a particular volume of his called No Bloodless Myth that tracks the Theodramatique. And in there, he has a couple of pages on the freedom stuff. Although I have to say, he says that the one is prior to the other, and actually flips it based on the text in Balthazar. So I recommend that book, but also there's a little
caveat. Yeah,
you're right. How whether you hang on to Balthazar's particular terminology or not, what's recognized is that finite freedom is really first given to itself. And even though we want to describe a primary meaning of freedom is my really possessing myself, I am autonomos in some sense. I have self-law. That self-law is given, and so it's never in the first instance about simply internal ordering, but it's always dialogical in that way. And therefore, its full flowering takes the form of consent. And you can't consent if there's not a sort of prior will established. But Balthazar's point in speaking that way is that the perfection and the motion of freedom from self-law to consent to the will of another, that move from self to consent is not a violent move that you sort of struggle to do, although sin makes it that way. But that's already inbuilt to the notion of freedom having been given to itself, because it's through and through from another. Therefore, to consent to the will of another is fundamentally and not secondarily a free thing to do. So in a way, that language of gift and then response is perfectly apt for describing the dynamics there. And he's in dialogue with some particular historical figures there. We don't need to get into that, but this recognition that I am first given to myself from another, and that's not a threat to my being myself. And in fact, further, unless I make of myself, unless I see that freedom as a task, which calls for me to make a gift or a further response of personal gratitude to another, then I'm not actually not exercising freedom. Why is this important? Christ is perfectly free, and he's perfectly divine, perfectly human, and perfectly expressing his freedom when he pours himself out for all eternity as bread in the Eucharist. So it's gift of self for the sake of another is the fulfillment of freedom, and not the sort of turning around of an otherwise interiorly oriented freedom. Simple point, actually. That freedom it's beyond the sort of typical Survey Pinker's sense of freedom for excellence. I think it's more than that. It's inherently personalist or personalistic, just to describe it that way.
Yes.
But it also has in mind that creation, metaphysically, is the ground of finite freedom, and that metaphysical ground of finite freedom is made in the image of another freedom, namely Christ, the second person, the image of the Word, the particular freedom of the Son to be wholly himself for all eternity from the Father, which is simultaneous from all eternity with his grateful response in love to the Father, which as it were makes the third person of the Trinity to be the love of them both. So that
is no, that's incredibly helpful. Sorry, you at one point you cut off, but it sped up and I caught up with you.
Oh, gosh,
no, you're good. Our internet's kind of a little giving on my side. It's probably
will
giving
sort
some
that out. Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully. No, that was incredibly helpful. In fact, it kind of prompted some thoughts. There's something here going on in Balthazar from listening to you that reminds me a lot of what's going on in both John Paul II and Rottzinger. And maybe one way that initially comes to mind of how to describe this is a redemption of the distorted understanding of freedom, of modern understanding. There's a redemption of the language of autonomy and of independence, but within a deeper, larger dependence on God, precisely because we're not God. Like there seems to be this kind of gathering the insight of modern liberal thought, you might say, and saying, actually, this belongs to the tradition, but in a much more capacious and satisfying register. I mean, Ratzinger, at one point in the Introduction to Christianity, says, ironically, Christianity could be described as a philosophy of freedom. And it's not at all how modern thought kind of depicts Christianity. Modern thought sees itself very much as a rejection of the burden of Christianity and a assertion of the autonomous self. But here, it's I just find it so fascinating and beautiful that through this quote unquote heresy of modern freedom, a richer understanding of freedom is developing in these thinkers that is profoundly traditional, but most definitely a development. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. We're learning what we really mean by saying that we're
freedom.
free in Christ.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking a lot about the Trinity just based on the questions I'm getting in class. And one thing that's become clear, especially as I am revisiting Thomas during these weeks, Thomas makes the point that if there's something imminent, so to start to transition to where I think you wanted to go, if there's an imminent procession in God, it must also be subsistent, which is to say that if there's something in God, it has to really exist, sort of participate in what we mean by divinity, ipsum esse subsistent. And so when Thomas describes the persons, in a way, what he's saying is that they are infinitely different. So the Father is not the Son and will never be the Son, and perfectly united in that relational difference. And so a clear-eyed view of the Trinity will show you that there can be sort of perfect, different, perfect, infinite, complete otherness inside of, in fact, expressive of what we need to mean when we talk about unity. That has to illuminate how we talk about properly conceived, free from sin, finite freedom. That I can be entirely from another and therefore really myself, and an entire orientation back toward the other is a sort of recapitulation, taking ownership, taking ownership of what I in fact already am. So it's both it mirrors the sort of exitus reditus, and it's that personal element of I'm really doing it. This isn't automatic. This involves my becoming me in an interesting way.
Yeah. Wow. No, I'm gonna have to think about that. Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah. Okay. So you're right. This is a perfect place to maybe clarify some terms for anyone who's new to some of these terms. Maybe let's start with just that one, those two terms, immanent and economic. What do those mean?
Economic, from the Greek oikonomia, household order. When theologians are speaking in a Trinitarian register, they'll talk about the economy and the theology. The economy means the persons of the Trinity as we see them in history or in salvation history, of course, in particular. So the economy is, now in particular, it's a reference to, so we describe God's inner life in terms of personal processions or relations of origin. So the theology is that the Son proceeds from the Father from all eternity, and the Spirit, or the Son is eternally begotten of the Father, and the Spirit proceeds from them both. So describing perceptions as relations of origin, that's the theology. And we see the theology in an economic expression. So we see God in history. That's the basic division. The action of God in salvation history is the economy, and then the theology, or the immanent, because it's increasingly harder for us in English to say economy and theology, and for that to be intelligible to like 99% of people. It's easier to say the immanent, and then economic describing God ad extra, and immanent describing God ad intra, in himself and then out of himself. But even then, you got to be God can't be out of him. There's no outside of God. Creation's inside of God, in fact, and other than that. So,
can I pause right there very, very briefly? This is another insight that has recast the way I think about this completely, based on Margaret Turek's book and reading your dissertation, is this idea that creation is not ad extra in the visible image sense, but ad extra in the sense of otherness, but within the Trinity, but you might say between the Father and the Son. And to me, just seeing it that way has really revolutionized the way I look at the world, honestly. Almost like this kind of opening space within the love of the Trinity for humanity and the cosmos, in that dance of love. Rotzinger kind of talks about this, of heaven being the space in the Trinity for our humanity. I mean, to me, that's just so beautiful, and that it's Christ's humanity.
That's just right. All of that is a sort of second stage corollary to this primary scriptural affirmation that all things are made through the Word. And so then you describe, okay, the Word is from the Father before all eternity, and because we're talking about God, there can be no outside of that. Therefore, creation is, it's the logoi in the logos. So therefore, creation is in God. There, in principle, there can be no outside of God. But recognizing infinite personal difference, there's something like otherness. And here you begin, we're stretching language, we're stretching concepts, and we're constantly picture thinking. There's spatial imagery here, there's temporal imagery here. But so you start to say something like, or as if, or there's, Balthazar will start to use super. There's super time. The source of what we mean by temporal procession is rooted in the relationship between the Father and the Son.
No, that's super helpful. Super in German is Ur, right? You are. Is that how he uses it, or is it something else?
So, Balthazar tends to use in the language of original or originating.
Oh, okay.
More typically, it would be the Uber. So more the Greek sense of hyper.
That makes sense.
So I tend to hear Uber, hyper, super, and then Ur is something like architectonic, like below first,
like in arche.
Exactly.
Okay, no, that's helpful. That's good to know.
Case, I'd have to look at the text, but that's at least that's the vision that's still in my mind at this point.
Okay, so one way I like to, Bible study sometimes turns into me on the whiteboard giving a lecture of things I've recently read. And they hate me for it, they love me for it, I don't know. But the point, though, is that the way I would explain this to some of my friends at Bible study is, if I was an honest person with integrity, you could know. Hear me? I think
It broke up a little bit. I can hear you again now.
Okay, sorry about that. My internet, I don't know what's going on.
But let me just integrity, and then the internet disagreed with you.
Yes. Exactly. So if I am someone who has a certain amount of integrity, then you can know something about me, about who I am, based on what I do. And so, for example, if I act in a certain way, that action in space and time, among people, among friends, reveals something to you about who I am in myself. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this is the way I explain this to some of my friends. The difference between immanent and economic. It's an analogy, of course, but that would be one way to do it. But at one point, you in the dissertation you talk about this. You use a term that I think it's the first time I've come across it, which is Trinitarian inversions.
Yep.
What is that? and are there some examples? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, I mean, the genre of dissertation, if you're going to write on someone, you need to like make sure all the important categories for them appear there, whether it's like crucial for the case you're making or not. In my case,
Okay.
it is very relevant. But just to say that that phrasing, Trinitarian inversion, is a sort of direct subheading from multiple places in Balthazar's writing. So it's him. He is retrieving an idea very ancient from Irenaeus, in fact. Forget Trinitarian and inversion for a second. What we're trying to describe is, so we know that the Son and the Spirit come from the Father. But in the incarnate life of Christ, so therefore the Son is the one who with the Father sends the Spirit. We know that that's the Trinitarian dynamic. That's our faith. Mm-hmm. But in the incarnation, the Spirit overshadows Mary, and the Son comes from the intercession of the Spirit. In the active ministry of Christ, the Spirit leads him into the desert to be tempted, hovers over him at his baptism, is the person in whom he prays to the Father prior to his death and resurrection. So once he's raised from the dead and about to ascend to his life and glory, then we see the Son more typically sending the Spirit in history. Trinitarian inversion is a term used to describe that dynamic in the incarnation prior to death and resurrection, where the relationship between Son and Spirit seems to be flipped or inverted, where it's the Spirit mediating the will of the Father to the Son in history. Balthazar will say that that is fitting for one of the two ways we tend to speak about the Spirit. The Spirit is, because he's the love of them both, or the bond between them, that it's appropriate and indeed fitting that as the Son is living out his mission in history, that the Spirit be the objective witness to their love. So the Son receives the Father's will in and through literally the guidance of the Spirit in history. And that's still, so it's still the Trinity undivided. There's no change to their eternal relations, but the Trinity looks inverted for a while. And then when he's raised to the right hand of the Father, he sends the Spirit, which is how we get included in that relationship. So objective witness, and then sort of Lord and giver of life. That's a rough division, but it in that sense, it's not just like a fancy, German translated to English phrase that Balthazar came up. We're just trying to like, what's going on with the fact that the Spirit seems to send the Son? That's all. Yeah.
So, okay, that's first of all, it's beautiful. It's almost like a chiasmic relationship between immanent and economic. This is another thing I talk about in my Bible study, right? A lot of biblical texts are like this. And I argue that the first paragraph of the Catechism is a masterpiece of chiasm. It goes, A, B, C, C, B, A. God infinitely, what is it? Good within himself, created man, but man was divided by sin. And so through the redemption, he's reunited in the church so that he can share in God's inner life. A, B, C, C, B, A. And that is, it seems to me, the structure of revelation. The person reveals himself, the revelation is received, and then we respond and give ourselves back, and there's a unity. It's just so beautiful. And so, this kind of brings us back to this relationship between immanent and economic. And so, but one reveals the other. So Christ, first of all, the Son becoming man, and then dying on the cross and rising from the dead, dying on the cross, being in the tomb, rising from the dead. This reveals something to us about the inner life of the Trinity, about the relationship between Father and Son in the immanent Trinity. So maybe, I guess my next question would be, how do we avoid two dangers here? And a lot of critics will show up here. One danger is driving a wedge between immanent and economic by saying God can't change, he's impassible. Therefore, talking about some kind of emptying of self within God would talk about some kind of passibility, some kind of change. So how do we avoid both passibilizing God and driving a wedge between economic and immanent?
I'll give it a shot. There's a lot of ways to answer that. I'll try to stay grounded in the resources in Balthazar in particular for the sake of this conversation. But I mean, the first point to make is that, look, that's a good question, and we should be rightfully wary of compromising the integrity of what we mean by divinity. God is immutable. God is omniscient. All of those things. And the central mystery of our faith is the passion of Christ, which has to be real.
Yeah.
Given the language that emerges from the Christological and Trinitarian controversies, especially the communication of idioms, we really, and the church has magisterially come to say that God has died, that one of the Trinity has suffered, and so on. You have to be careful how you say those things, but we can say them. So in one sense, like, boldly go and, like, say as much as you can and correct yourself along the way. But, like, we have to come to describe that something has really happened here. It's mysterious. Now, for Balthazar, the key theological notion at work here, and there's a really great recent monograph by a fellow named Jacob Lett called, I think it's just called Hans Ers Von Balthazar's Theology of Representation. But this term representation, which is different, we're talking in terms of soteriology, how redemption works. Representation being established to be different from this idea of substitutionary atonement.
Rottzinger talked a lot about this too. I found.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, they were. Indeed, these questions were taken up by the International Theological Commission when they were all on them. So this was clearly there's a mutual interpenetration there between their work and the 1979 and 1981 select questions on Christology, and then there's another follow-up document on Christology. They take it up there too. It's really good.
Fascinating.
Balthazar wants to propose that the way we talk about how atonement works is through this phrase representation. Christ represents us. In English, it doesn't have a great valence. It sounds like, an elected representative. In German, the word is this Stellvertretung. That's what it means. And the more literal translation would be taking our place, which sounds a lot like what English substitution means. But at the root of Stellvertretung is this word Stelle, which just means place. And Balthazar's theological point is that and I'm glad we've talked the way that we have, because he says, because the place of the world vis-a-vis God is in God already, that the world is made in the image of the Word and therefore sort of participates uniquely in the eternal being of the Son, then it means that Christ can take our place without losing his own place because it's already in him.
Yeah.
Well, it's a sort of metaphysical ground. I don't like slinging the word metaphysical too much, but it's a grounding at the level of Trinitarian being, of the possibility of Christ taking our place without changing his own, because it's already his place.
Yeah.
So in that way, the principled boundary between economic and immanent, what at the very least we can say is that because the economic outpouring of, so Thomas will say that when we speak in the language of Trinitarian missions, it's simply the presence in the economy of the eternal processions.
Yeah.
Balthazar then talks about, the mission of Christ is one of representation of all for the sake of all. So that's where we are. And therefore we're saying that when Christ takes our place, it's the appearance in history, or a rather famous quote of his from his short text of Theology of History. It's the translation into creatureliness of this heavenly form of existence. What's mysterious is that the Son's obedience to the will of the Father, which culminates in death and descent to being one dead among the dead, discloses the Son's love for the Father, the Father's love for the Son, and therefore the love of the Father for creation. And all of that happens in principle without anything needing to. We actually don't even need to, whether this could change God. When you see representation in that way, when you have a proper conception of the relationship between creation and the Trinity, you wouldn't need to pose that. And God isn't becoming more himself by generously doing that. So that's the other danger. We can say all sorts of things that, like, God can do whatever he wants in history without threatening himself, but you also need to say he's not becoming more himself. He's not becoming God through submitting to sin and so on. Not sinning, but submitting to sin's effects. So just to reiterate, those are the things that need to be guarded against. But a proper notion of the Trinity allows you simply to then discuss the fittingness and of how each of these elements discloses this. So, not to speak autobiographically for a second, but I've always been
Mhm.
struck by this affirmation from Gaudium et Spes 22 that Jesus Christ reveals the Father's love. And he
Mhm.
does that through the mission of salvation. And there's a lot of fruitful ways in the history of theology to look at any of the mysteries of Christ's life and see how this discloses the Father and humanity in total.
Mhm.
Where I see Balthazar situated in the history of theology is saying, okay, yes, that has to include also what we mean by his suffering, his death, and his
Yeah.
being dead, and his being dead.
Yeah.
So how
Yeah.
does
Yeah.
the being dead of the Son of God show who God really is and the perfection of man's freedom? That was the question I asked. That's what I obsessed over and why I wrote about this. How is
Yes.
finite freedom disclosed to itself through this particular mystery or this particular moment in the Paschal mystery? So,
Yes.
yeah.
So two things. Number one, to me, what's been really helpful in to think about this from listening to what you just said is the resituating the world within between the Father and the Son, in the Son, vis-a-vis the Father,
Mhm.
helps not passibilize God, so to speak,
Yeah.
precisely because it's within what's already there. You might
Right.
say,
Right.
but the funny thing is that what you said last, what you ended with is it's exactly my next question, which is, how does Christ's death and descent among the dead ad inferos, right? How does that reveal something about the inner life of the Trinity, the processions, the relationship between Father, Son, and Spirit? I mean, that's a big question, but maybe
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
threads, yeah, some fragments.
Without circling too much the simply controversial elements, I think the safest and most fruitful thing to talk about, especially fruitful for prayer, is that
Mhm.
one way to talk about the Son's mission. So the Son's mission is to save all men, is to
Yeah.
solve the problem of sin and of death, and that's expressed in this key of obedience. And that
Mhm.
obedience takes on the strongest partner. Athanasius On the Incarnation, when he's describing the sort of why of the suffering and death of Christ, he avers to this wrestling imagery. Christ wants to take on,
Mm.
a good wrestler doesn't take on the weak opponent, he takes on the strongest opponent. And
Yeah.
so even that ancient language from Athanasius of describing Christ comes to face the mystery of death, of desolation, of distance from God. And he does that not simply to show what it's like to love the Father, but as his actual love of the Father in this key
Mm.
of obedience. You've mentioned
Mm.
Margaret Turek a number of times. Her short work, Atonement, absolutely illuminated. I mean, I read it just before I really set about to write this thing, and it proved to be the
Yeah.
key for like really holding it all together. If
Yeah.
sin, as Rottzinger says, is a denial of creatureliness in the sense of denying the goodness of my being from another and a false
Yeah.
self-assertion. What the Son
Mhm.
does, the way the Son redeems us is by reasserting his sonship as a creature, which shows
Yeah.
both that sonship is our sort of form and finality, and that
Yeah.
humanity properly lived is apt to be the filiality, that filial
Yeah.
love.
Yeah.
Balthazar's point is just this, that's accomplished through really
Yeah.
under the power of suffering the consequences of sin, which is to say, being separated from God.
Yeah.
Now, the particular question of the layers of hell, the descent, and how that relates to the
Yeah.
question of universalism, we can pose that. But I think once you see that simple point, it's actually a little bit easier to be willing to walk with him a little bit further
Yeah.
in this speculation. Of course, he
Yeah.
would need to suffer all that it means. What's not so both God became man that man might become God, and what's not assumed is not healed. So
Yeah.
if the death is not really suffered, if the sufferings are simply in the flesh and not in, let's say, the psychology or the intelligence or the will,
Mhm.
then the question can be asked, is it really the true assumption of what's properly human?
Yeah.
or the consequences of the human action of denial of our creatureliness. So Turek says it transforms the negative sinful opposition by the assertion of filial opposition by way of obedience and the free suffering of death, which Balthazar describes in a lot of passive terms. He becomes dead. This happens to him. But this happens to him. Yeah, go ahead, please.
No. I just want to pause right there, because that to me is another insight that I'm still kind of thinking about right now. This opposition, right? What's revealed in the world, the fallen world of sin, through the redemption of Christ, who dies because of our sin, is something within the Trinity. But not that there's an analog to sin in the Trinity, but rather that in the fallen world is revealed that there's a kind of non-fallen death of obedience, is a love death that is not due to sin. Obviously we die because of sin, but there's a kind of death that, this is kind of abstracting it from the world of our experience, but there's a kind of death that is not because of sin but because of love. And to me, this is a fruitful way of understanding what's going on. This is language that's very bold, but what's going on in the Trinity, right? But and also how to understand something good about death in our world, not just the evil aspect of it, something good about the love that can show up in the suffering caused by sin.
That's right.
And so this is something I'm still thinking about, because it's a beautiful distinction, quite frankly. I think.
Just a couple thoughts on that. You want to hold at the same time, at one and the same time, everything Scripture says about death, that God did not make death and that God hates death. That's like what we know about it. And that death means separation, non-communication. That's the original meaning of Sheol. This, as Larry Tapp used to describe it in the classroom, that shadowy, skanky place called Sheol. It's the zone of non-communication between others and God. So that's the reality of death. And our path toward eternal life doesn't skirt we still, first of all, we die in Christ, and death is overcome by way, this is Pauline imagery. Paul describes Christ's victory over death in the way that a conquering Roman warlord would have paraded its defeated leader in chains through the city. Christ uses death now as the way by which we are united to his eternal life. So we are born in sin and united to that body which died. That body which died and therefore rose. And so you want to say that both death can be seen now in the order of redemption in a sort of analogical mirror of what we mean by the fruitful, positive distance of love that's necessary to talk about personal love, right? This sort of this Father is not the Son is not the Father. Therefore, you can speak of a distance which is positive, an opposition which is fruitful vis-a-vis I, thou. That death can express that, but also that death is our invention and God hates it, and it originally was, and why it needed to be redeemed was because it wasn't a fruitful opposition. It was an opposition that meant negation. Now it's an assertion of sonship, and now discipleship looks like unity with Christ on his cross in his dying in order to be with him in his rising. So I see Balthazar as a figure who just wants to walk with me through that middle point where he's being dead in order to then, the way he's able to describe resurrection and glory and the communion of saints is all the more rich and colorful. And I wrote a dissertation on one aspect of it. You need to say more, but at least see that, because of what he says about death and Holy Saturday, you can say even more. What do I mean by say more? I mean, you can see more. You can see more about what's beautiful, that discipleship is life through death. That's the good news in some sense.
Wow. No, I love the way you presented that. You said it. I was trying to say what you said. You just actually said it. This idea that, there's something about the fallen world and its consequences and how God responds to it that does in fact reveal something about love, about the Trinity, about God himself,
Yeah.
without saying that the negative aspect itself, well, it becomes an opportunity to reveal something positive, if that makes sense.
Yes, that's right.
And I just love the way you explained it. That makes so much sense, and it really does. I don't know. It's beautiful the way the Paschal mystery here is disclosing the glory of God,
Yeah,
of His
yeah, that's
love,
right.
right? The compassion of God. I mean, it's so beautiful.
Well,
So
thank you.
this actually, no, you're welcome. This actually is an opportunity to ask you. I mean, a question about, because I've heard people say this, and reading through your dissertation and listening to some other Balthazarians, I came to realize that this is not fair. So here's kind of the gist, right?
Mhm.
People are saying that Balthazar, I won't name names, but someone was saying Balthazar depicts himself as an ecclesial theologian, right? Which means that he thinks within the tradition. But here, for some weird reason, he just decides to do his own thing, right? And I'm characterizing a little bit, right? But I'm talking about specifically the reading of the creed in terms of Christ, not just going down to the limbo of Abraham's bosom or something, but all the
Yeah,
way to the hell of the damned. And so, it seems to me, so the argument goes that this is not what the tradition says. Christ doesn't go down to the hell of the damned, just to the hell of the,
yeah,
the fathers, right? But you point out, Balthazar points out, and this is obvious when you think about it, that hell, in a certain sense, doesn't exist yet, so to speak.
yeah,
Hell is a Christological category. It ensues from Christ's descent among the dead as a response, a rejection, a negative response to Christ's action to precisely go there. Therefore, in that sense, by being dead among the dead, by taking on the lot of fallen humanity, he not only reveals to us what death is, but what the rejection of the Father is as well. And so, I mean, that's very traditional, but it is very, it's pure. The way you put it was it's purified. It's purifying these eschatological categories. So I'll shut up and let you talk. Yeah.
No, yeah. First of all, if someone wants to be mad at Balthazar, like, be my guest, but let's be mad about the right things. He's actually bolder about hell in ways that most people don't understand.
Yeah.
Hell is more terrifying if you understand Balthazar rather
Yeah.
than less. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe we'll touch the universalism question, but people misread him dramatically on that.
Yeah.
I'm far more certain of my call to discipleship because I've adhered so closely to Balthazar, and I'm far more sort of existentially excruciating about my own behavior because I've listened to Balthazar.
Yeah.
I mean, his insight that true atheism is now possible only because of the redemption. Why? Because God has a face, and that
Yeah.
face, that person, has descended beyond my depths of the possible depths of my depravity to a sort of universal consequence of which that I can approach, but he'll always be on the other side of. And Balthazar holds on. I guess I'm just doing the universalism thing. Balthazar holds on to the
That's fine.
possibility
Yeah.
that I may still reject that love, but that possibility that I reject the loving face of Christ, who has acrobatically, as Bishop Barron likes to describe it, who's acrobatically descended to these depths. That's a new possibility because of the redemption. So hell is really
Yeah.
only possible now.
Yeah.
True atheism, true rejection of the person is possible in a new way.
Yeah.
So
And,
to back up, there's somewhat of an unfortunate, in fact, linguistic confusion in our tradition. And I did just a little bit of work on this in the dissertation. I think there's a book yet to be written, probably not by me because of how many languages are involved. But this confusion of Sheol versus Gehenna versus hell. So in the ancient world, Israel in particular, but this is also, in the Greek tradition, there's this idea of an underground place where the dead go, which is not a place of torture, but which for sure is a place from which no one ever returns. And sometimes the living can descend into it in many myths. Plato has this. This happens, in Homer, and I believe in the Aeneid as well. But it's a place of non-communication. So Sheol means, and what is non-communication? Well, it means to not be with God, which means to be distant from life. So it's a place of death, right? That's what it first means. when the creed speaks about descensus ad inferos comes from this root infieri, which just refers to the population of the dead. Inferos comes to be translated hell, lowercase. You have, I'm speaking in broad generalizations, but you have that notion with Christ's words about Gehenna, which was a particular geographic location seen to be also the entrance place to Sheol. You have all of that confusion, and then you have the magisterial, the beautiful imagery from Dante about the Inferno, and everyone thinks that when the creed speaks about hell, it's talking about this layered, fiery place of torture. Balthazar engages in this reading of those sources that shows that all three of the final, the two eschatological final states of heaven and hell, but purgatory as well, as the place of those who die in friendship with God, but who are not yet completely purified and who will go to heaven. Both of those are only possible because of the act of redemption. And his discussion of Holy Saturday shows that where Christ descends in truly being dead among the dead, descending, sort of drinking the consequences of sin to the dregs, as I describe it, grounds the possibility both of total and real union with God, namely in the person of the Son with his eternal communion with the Father, seated at the right hand of the Father, that we are welcomed into that. And there's now a new possibility of rejecting that. What does this do? It clarifies, first of all, our picture thinking. There's no one in hell first. There's simply the dead, which can sustain the language in our tradition of Christ descending to the bosom of Abraham, because that's all there is, actually. There's simply the dead, right? There's no one damned, so to speak, before he descends to them. Now, you have to look at particular texts and see who's talking about the hell of the damned and why. But this is the primary source for Balthazar's criticism of figures throughout the tradition, namely Augustine and Aquinas, who he basically, part of the criticism is that you're doing too much picture thinking and you haven't examined hell as a Christological category, as originating from the act of redemption. So this cutting off of, well, he only descends so far, is in fact just a category error in a way. Therefore,
can I just, I hate to interrupt you. This is fantastic, but I just want to say about this particular point you're making right here. To me, it's so convincing. It's so obvious that these eschatological categories are Christological. Ratzinger's book on eschatology, in a certain sense, kind of recasts all of eschatology through Christology. But if you think about it, it makes so much sense, because the Paschal mystery, the inbreaking through the incarnation of the now and not yet, eternity and time. This is very clearly the way we're supposed to think about these eschatological categories. So, like you said, Balthazar here is doing us a service by trying us to remind us, hey guys, okay, we're not in a kind of Dante pagan, mythology. Everything's Christological, right? It's funny because Balthazar is accused of being kind of mythological in his Kenosis and stuff, and turns out he's
critical of the myths of descent. Precisely.
Exactly. All right. I'll let you continue. Sorry, but
No. And just to say, without getting too much more detail, what's the advantage of speaking this way? I think that'll be a question a lot of people. It's a question I constantly have. So hell is a mystery of Christ. That puts a face to what's at stake, right? It's not whether I reject God, whether I'm a good person. It's whether I live my life in a way that in particular acts and all the time and in a sort of objective orientation. So not transcendental Thomism, a fundamental option, and neither is it sort of a once and done thing. Like it's both of those things. That is better sustained by this sense that whatever hell is, it's whatever eschatology is, it's my acceptance or rejection of this personal offer of the acrobatic descent to the consequences of my sin, and whether I'm going to assent to suffering the consequences of those sins with Christ or not. And so when Balthazar turns, especially in the little volume Dare We Hope, and in my preferred essay of his, the short discourse on hell, which is attached to it, when he turns to the saints to actually get some data. Okay, are there mystical visions of this? Do we have an account of this in the saints? The phenomena he finds among the saints is when they think about the mystery of hell, the desire that's expressed and what they want to do is sort of stand in the gap and either get Jesus off the cross and get up there themselves or be damned for the sake of others. And he says that is a clue to what recognizing hell as a mystery of Christ is meant to do for us devotionally. And the link then to where hell is supposed to be considered in the first week of the Ignatius exercises and in the latter weeks as well, that it's to be seen as I mean, in a way, this is going to sound super controversial, but in a way, what I'm saying is that the only thing we know about hell is that Christ was the first person to go there, or that Christ established it, right?
Right.
That he's the one who knows what it is from the inside. And whatever we can say about hell now, it would be to reject what he did.
Yeah.
And there's a great dispute, man, over whether that's possible or what that would have to look like. Balthazar holds that it's possible, perhaps improbable, but possible.
Yeah.
And therefore, more dramatic.
No. So, I mean, like you said, it sounds controversial, but it makes sense that because all of our eschatology is Christologically grounded, has its source in our Christology. It's there's no other way, it seems to me, to think about it. Like hell does come from this, and but this kind of gives a response to the universalists, which is you can't do away with hell precisely because of our Christology.
Yes.
And finally, you talked about it being personal, as opposed to belief in God being a good person. No, it's a personal encounter. That's the whole dramatic structure that Balthazar talks about. I mean, and that's not universalist at all. There's a real crisis moment, as you say in the dissertation. To me, I mean, this is not universalism at all. But there's a genuine hope of standing in the breach. But
yeah, and just to pile onto that, so there's different ways to describe universalism. The very common division now is like soft universalism and hard universalism, and I just want to say that Balthazar would be opposed to both. Soft universalism meaning all men will or must be saved. That whatever we mean by the resolution of all things, it's gonna include necessarily that all men be saved. Then there's hard universalism, which says that everything will be redeemed, including Satan repenting and the demons being angels again or being in heaven. Balthazar, for sure, just on that latter point, the demons are damned. There's no question about that. There's no possibility of conversion. So, I mean, on that level of universalism, there's no ground to stand on to say that he's a universalist. He's dramatically misread also on the soft universalism question. Not only does his argument lead to a really interesting new way of refuting universalism, it's a mystery of hell can go away. It's a mystery of Christ. And he also literally says all the time, thus the candle of apokatastasis of universal restoration is definitively like he says it all the time, that like he sees the objection and is constantly saying, nope, can't be that. That's precisely what we're safeguarding. So a generous reading of him, therefore, would also demand taking him at his word that no, he's trying to safeguard against that.
That's right.
So it's my impression.
That was so helpful to me because I honestly struggled with understanding the logic of hell in one sense, accepting it as a faithful Catholic, but trying to be faithful, right? But I didn't have a good grasp as the kind of intrinsic reason for it until I started to listen to what Balthazar had to say through people like you. So it's like it's Balthazar who kind of helped me understand why hell is a necessity Christologically, and yet how my attitude is to hope for the salvation of all my fellow human beings. I mean. Right. I couldn't find that kind of reason for hell in a surface reading of St. Thomas, that I had engaged in. You know what I mean? So to me, that's just powerful.
Yeah. I was going to comment on St. Thomas, but I shouldn't. I wanted to say this isn't definite yet. I'm in conversation with Ignatius Press to do a volume, something that would be titled like "Why We Need Holy Saturday." That would sort of it wouldn't simply be to unpack Balthazar, but it would be a more general audience version of this conversation, in fact, like why is this what is the advantage of understanding Holy Saturday in this way for devotional life and for theological clarity? So I hope to I mean, I think this is a gap in a lot of people's understanding of what's at the core of discipleship. This is the constant back and forth between communio types and folks who hear from Thomas and hear from Ralph Martin that, like, if you don't think about hell in this way, as many are damned, then your discipleship can't properly be animated. Margaret Turek did a lot of this work already in the appendix to her book Atonement, but I think there's more that can be said, and we should sort of
absolutely.
Yeah.
No, speaking about Dr. Turek and her book, I mean, you know, there's much to be said about the whole spirituality of vicarious atonement. Thinking of Therese of Lisieux. I mean, you know, when they talk about when Larry Chapp talks about the dynamite of Vatican II that hasn't gone off. I mean, and this idea of universal call to holiness. I mean, I really do think that it's precisely this vicarious atonement spirituality, especially in our secular atheistic world. That's the dynamite, that kind of spirituality, it seems to me, is what needs to go off. And Balthazar is at the heart, like on a kind of intellectual academic register. He's at the heart of this. So yeah.
Amen.
Awesome. Well, it's been an hour and 20 minutes. We should probably bring this to a close.
Yeah, we've been to hell and back, so that's a lot.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. Awesome. Well, Dr. Drain, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Audience, if you guys enjoyed this conversation, consider liking the video, share the video, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can be notified for the next one I'll be doing. And if you feel so inclined, you can help me out at patreon.com/logos project, $5, $1, whatever you want to do. Dr. Drain, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Audience,
my pleasure.
Anytime. Yep. Audience, we'll see you guys next time. God bless.